Hello and welcome to today's edition of the Daf Yomi Menachot Tractate. Thank you. Menachot Daf 100 Amud B, Part 2. The Gemara answers. The Bryce decides Rabbi Shimon's opinion states one reason why meat cooked in milk is susceptible to impurity and another. One reason is that it is food that you can feed to others. Therefore, it is called food for the purpose of being susceptible to impurity. And another reason is that even for him, i.e. a Jew, although it is commonly prohibited to eat the milk and meat, it had a time when each was fit to be eaten. So what's the footnote? The Dide Nami Haisalo Sha'asa Kosher. By contrast, with regard to the other cases mentioned, such as the ox that was stoned, they never had a time when they were fit to be eaten. The reason is that since all animals have the presumptive status of being forbidden until they are slaughtered properly, therefore, even when these animals were still alive, they were neither permitted for consumption nor susceptible to its impurity. See Rashi. With regard to diverse kinds, in a vineyard, despite the fact that they could have been fit for consumption before they were prohibited, they still could not be susceptible to impurity. This is because the prohibition takes effect while they are attached to the ground, and items attached to the ground are not susceptible to impurity. Okay. Before they cook together, therefore they remain susceptible to impurity. The Gemara raises an objection to the opinion of Rabbi Shaya from Abaita. Rabbi Shimon says, there is a case of the leftover of an offering that is susceptible to its impurity of food. Although it is prohibited to derive benefit from the meat of an offering left over beyond the time during which it is permitted for consumption, the meat is still susceptible to impurity of food. In according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, the Rambam Sefer Tahara Hilchot Tumas Ochanin 125. But there is also a case of the leftover an offering that is not susceptible to the impurity of food. How so? If it was left overnight before the sprinkling of the blood on the altar, it is not susceptible to its impurity of food, or it never became fit for consumption. But if it was left overnight after the sprinkling of the blood, it is susceptible to its impurity of food, since from after the sprinkling of the blood until it was left overnight, it was fit for consumption. The Brisa continues, and with regard to pickle, both in cases of offerings of the most sacred order, so Kodshe Kadoshim, of the most sacred order, this category of offerings includes burnt offerings, sin offerings, guilt offerings, and communal peace offerings. Due to the high sanctity, a number of unique halachot apply to them. First, these offerings are slaughtered only in the northern section of the temple courtyard. Second, they are eaten only on the day the animal is sacrificed and the night immediately thereafter. Third, the offerings are eaten only by priests and only within the temple courtyard. Fourth, the prohibition against misuse of consecrated property applies to these offerings as soon as they are consecrated. Once their blood has been sprinkled on the altar, the prohibition against misuse continues to apply only to the portions of the offering that are to be consumed on the altar, but not to the portions that are to be eaten. The meat of the offering is not susceptible to the impurity of food. This is because it was rendered forbidden for consumption at the beginning of the sacrificial rite and was never fit for consumption. If the priest rendered a meal offering pigle, it is susceptible to the impurity of food. Since it did not have a period of time when it was acceptable, i.e. when there was still flour before it was consecrated as a meal offering. This ruling contradicts Rabbi Oshaya's understanding that according to Rabbi Shimon, a meal offering that became pigle is not susceptible to the impurity of food. The Gemara answers, that is not difficult, as here in the Braita where Rabbi Shimon ruled that the meal offering that became pigle is susceptible to the impurity of food, is referring to a case where it had time in which it was fit for consumption. There, where it is not susceptible to impurity of food, is referring to a case where it did not have time in which it was fit for consumption. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances where it did not have time in which it was fit for consumption? Before the flour was consecrated as a meal offering, it was certainly permitted for consumption. The Gemara answers, this would occur where he consecrated the wheat while it is still attached to the ground, and it was therefore not susceptible to impurity. Once harvested, it was already prohibited for consumption. The Gemara raises a difficulty. The flour may still have a time in which it was fit, then a redeemer before it's placed in a service vessel. Why is it considered as not having time in which it was fit for consumption? The Gemara qualifies the question. This distinction between flour that came from wheat that was consecrated before it was harvested, and wheat or flour that was consecrated at a later point, works so well according to the version of that which Rabbi Shaya said, impure meal offerings and libations that have not been consecrated in the service vessel are redeemed. If they are pure, they are not redeemed. Accordingly, it works out well if the flour does not have a time in which it was fit for consumption, when it came from wheat that was consecrated before it was being harvested. It could not be redeemed and was made fit for consumption. But according to this version of what Rabbi Shai said, even pure meal offerings and libation are redeemed. There remains a possibility of letting him redeem the meal offering while it is pure and before it is consecrated in the service vessel. Therefore, it should be considered as having a time in which it is fit for consumption. The Gemara answers, in any event, he has now not redeemed it. Therefore, it is not considered to have a time in which it is fit for consumption. The Gemara asks, how can flour be considered as not having a time in which it is fit for consumption? Because he has not redeemed it, even though he could have redeemed it. Since in a case where if he wants, he may redeem it, don't we attribute to Rabbi Shimon that he said that any item that stands to be redeemed, it is as if it already is redeemed? The Gemara cites a source for this assertion. As is taught in a Bait, the Rabbi Shimon says a red heifer, even if it has been slaughtered and therefore prohibited to derive benefit from it, is susceptible to the rich impurity of food. Para mituma tumas ochalin. Although it is prohibited to derive benefit from the flesh of the red heifer, it is still susceptible to the impurity of food, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon 125, since it had a time in which it was fit. The Rish Lakish said, explaining how it is possible to derive from this halacha that any item that could have been redeemed is considered as though it had been redeemed. Rabbi Shimon would say that a red heifer is redeemed with money even when it has already been slaughtered and placed on its prior. Para nifteis al gav me'arachta. The Gemara in Shavuot 11b explains that the red heifer is redeemed even after being placed on the prior, because it is included in the category of items consecrated for temple maintenance. It is not considered an offering, as it is not slaughtered in the temple, nor is its blood sprinkled there. Rather, all its actions are performed outside the temple area on the Mount of Olives. Although it is purchased using temple money, since it is used for purposes of purification, it does not possess intrinsic sanctity like other offerings. What was the other footnote? A red heifer that was slaughtered as a non-sacred animal may be redeemed, but if it was slaughtered as a red heifer on its prior, it may not be redeemed. This ruling is in accordance with the conclusion of the Gemara in Shavuos 11b, Ram Seif Tahar, Hefchot Paraduma 1.9. Preparation for being burned. If so, a meal offering that could have been redeemed should also be considered fit for consumption, as it is considered as though it had been redeemed. The Gemara answers, how can these cases be compared? Granted, with regard to the red heifer, it is considered to be an item that stands to be redeemed, since if he found another animal choicer than it, one red heifer was purchased and then a choicer one was discovered, the first one is redeemed even though it remains unblemished. 110. There is a mitzvah to redeem the first one and purchase the choicer one with the money. But is there a mitzvah to redeem these meal offerings? The Gemara challenges, but there is a case where sacrificial meat remained overnight before the sprinkling of the blood occurred, where there was a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood the day before, and if he had wanted, he could have sprinkled it, and the offering would not have been disqualified. And yet, Rabbi Shimon teaches in the Brit that sacrificial meat that remained overnight is not susceptible to the rich impurity of food, even though it should have been considered fit for consumption on the day the offering was slaughtered, as the blood stood to be sprinkled, and there was a mitzvah to sprinkle it. The Gemara answers, here we are dealing with a case where there was not sufficient time remaining in the day to sprinkle the blood, as the offering was slaughtered close to sunset. Therefore, the blood did not stand to be sprinkled, and the meat was therefore never fit for consumption. The Gemara asks, but in a case where the offering was slaughtered when there was sufficient time remaining in the day to sprinkle the blood, what would then be the halacha according to Rabbi Shimon? Would meat left overnight be susceptible to rich impurity of food? If so, rather than Rabbi Shimon teaching the following, sacrificial meat that was left overnight before the blood was sprinkled is not susceptible to the rich impurity of food. If left overnight after the sprinkling of the blood, it's susceptible to rich impurity of food. Instead, let them distinguish within the case itself. In what case is this statement said? When is sacrificial meat left overnight with the blood of the offering having been sprinkled not susceptible to rich impurity of food? It's in a case where there was not sufficient time remaining in the day to sprinkle the blood, but if there was sufficient time remaining in the day to sprinkle the blood, it's susceptible to the rich impurity of food. The Gemara answers, that is indeed what he is saying in the Braita. And if an offering was left overnight before it was available for sprinkling, i.e. if it was slaughtered so late in the day that there was no time to sprinkle the blood, it is not susceptible to the rich impurity of food. By contrast, if it was left overnight after it was available for sprinkling, i.e. there was still time to sprinkle the blood, then it is susceptible to the rich impurity of food. The Gemara asks, does Rabbi Shimon hold that an item that stands to be redeemed is treated as though it had already been redeemed, and it is therefore considered to have had a time in which it is fit, even if it was never actually redeemed? But isn't it so that when one renders either offerings of the sacred order or offerings of a lesser sanctity pigul, there was a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood once the offering was slaughtered? Just finish that sentence. And if he had wanted, he could have sprinkled the blood of these offerings properly. So what's the footnote? Pigul ben bekanshe kadoshim ben hakadoshim kolim mitzvah the okay. With regard to an offering that was slaughtered for its own sake, or a meal offering in which the removal of a handful was not performed for its own sake, whether it was done intentionally or unintentionally, the priest must complete the rest of the service for its own sake and with the proper intention. And that's in the Rambam Sefer Vod Hilchot Pesula Hamagdashin 15:3. Thank you for listening and all the best. Bye.